The fence went up on a Thursday. It wasn't loud. No sirens, no protest, no warning. Just a crew in reflective vests arriving at dawn with posts, chain link rolls, and clipboards full of permits. The sky was still gray when the drilling started, each metal clang echoing across the open land like a gavel nobody asked for. By the time she noticed it, the first 100 feet were already in place. Cora May Talbot stood at the edge of her long gravel driveway, boots dusted with early dew, holding a ceramic mug in both hands like a prayer. Her flannel was buttoned high. A wind moved through the cottonwood trees behind her, the same trees she'd watched sway since she was a girl, back when this stretch of land was just acres and sky. Now it was HOA land. Or at least, that's what they thought. The property line ran jagged through a former pasture she'd converted to crops years ago: tomatoes, squash, green beans, a few rows of sweet corn. The lot was zoned agricultural before the neighborhood crept in, before the tennis courts and mailbox covenants and flowerbed uniformity, before the board, before the meetings. The fence bisected it like a scar. She walked out slowly, gravel crunching under her, nodding once at the young foreman who barely looked up from his blueprint. "Excuse me," she said, soft but clear. "Can I ask what this is about?" The man gestured vaguely with his pen. "Easement security," he said. "Per HOA directive. Limiting open access to prevent foot traffic through common areas." Her brow furrowed. "That's not common land. That's my access route. Has been since my father farmed it." He shrugged. "We're just following orders. Any dispute goes to the HOA." She didn't argue. She just stood there, watching the fence crawl across the horizon like a slow insult. The gate, a steel-latched mechanism built into a central post, was already welded in. Industrial. Tall. No code box. Just a keyhole. And a sign. Access restricted. HOA permit required. By dusk, the field was sealed. Cora didn't shout. She didn't call the sheriff or rally neighbors or fire off emails dripping with exclamation points. She walked back to the house, boiled water for tea, and opened a drawer in the hallway where her father's old deeds were kept, hand-labeled in pencil, tied in string. She didn't need to look at them. She knew exactly what they said. That stretch of land had been right-of-way for 3 generations. The easement ran like a seam between her acreage and the newly planned subdivision. The HOA had always known it, but over the years, as new board members came in and newer money built bigger fences, they'd started to treat the map like a suggestion. And now, they'd locked her out of her own crops. That night, she walked the perimeter with a flashlight. The fence ran the length of 400 feet. No gaps. No latch from her side. The gate faced the subdivision road, which meant if she wanted access to her own harvest, she'd have to drive 3 miles around and ask permission to use the gate. She wouldn't. Not like that. The next day, the letter arrived. Typed, on HOA stationery. Full of pleasantries. "Dear Ms. Talbot," it began. "In accordance with newly updated HOA security measures, we have installed a perimeter fence to preserve the integrity of shared residential spaces and to discourage unauthorized foot traffic." It went on. Buried near the end was the line that mattered. "All previous implied use of easement pathways will now be subject to access scheduling and board approval." They knew. They knew exactly what they'd done, and they assumed she wouldn't fight. Cora folded the letter neatly, tucked it under her mug, and stood for a long time at the back window. The rows of tomato stakes beyond the chain link glinted in the morning sun, already starting to lean under the weight of late-season fruit. Her field didn't care about politics. It just wanted tending. She finished her tea and went to the garage. The first thing she pulled out wasn't her tractor or her tools. It was a rolled-up county zoning map she hadn't touched in years. The ink was faded, but the lines were clear. So was the plat number for the fence line. But what drew her attention wasn't her own property. It was the sliver of land the gate post stood on. It wasn't HOA land. Not exactly. It was what they called a lot hold, a tiny parcel created during the subdivision's original layout, meant for future development. It had been transferred several times through shell companies and defunct contractors. As of the last record, it was still owned by a now-dissolved landscaping LLC. A dead paper trail, which meant, if it hadn't been updated. She opened her laptop and began the slow, deliberate process of checking county deeds, registrar records, and purchase filings. It took hours. Tea turned to cold water. Sunlight faded. But finally, In a line of fine print buried in a 2009 bulk acquisition document, she found it. Lot hashtag 38B. Gate parcel. Size. 0.04 acres. Status. Unclaimed private property. No active deed transfer since 2011. She leaned back, blinking. That gate. That key. It was sitting on land the HOA didn't technically own. And someone with a sharp enough eye and the right intention, could claim it. She sat still for a long time, not smiling, not gloating, just remembering how they'd looked past her in every meeting, how they'd assumed she was slow because she didn't raise her voice, how they'd dismissed her handwritten notes about water drainage, about fence line encroachment, about shared access. She reached for her phone, not to call a lawyer, to call her cousin, who worked as a title examiner 3 towns over. "I need a quiet favor," she said. And that was the start, not of a lawsuit, not of a protest, of something much quieter, much sharper, the kind of correction that doesn't need shouting, just a deed. And time. The sun came up slow and silver the next morning, casting a mist across the pastures that clung to the edges of Cora's land like breath that hadn't exhaled. She moved through the quiet like she always had, feeding the hens, sweeping the porch, pouring her tea with the steadiness of someone who knew that power didn't always need a microphone. While the rest of the neighborhood prepped for another HOA meeting about hedge heights and acceptable mailbox colors, Cora was at her dining table, maps unrolled and county files opened across the worn oak surface. Her cousin Mara, who had once worked at the regional land title office and still knew how to read legal filings like bedtime stories, called around noon. "You were right," she said, her voice dry with both awe and amusement. Lot 38B never transferred into HOA control. The paperwork stalled after the development company went belly up in 2011. It's basically an orphan parcel, and still privately zoned. Cora asked. "Yep, zoned private use. Tagged as low significance during reassessment. It's probably the smallest lot in the entire subdivision. It holds no water rights, no build rights, and no assessed agricultural value. Except it holds a gate." Mara chuckled. "And that, dear cousin, makes it very, very significant." Cora nodded slowly. "Can you help me start the acquisition process?" "Already submitted the initial inquiry," Mara said. "You'll need to file a quiet title action to clear the old liens and notify any claimants. But based on the paper trail, nobody's touched it in over a decade. It's yours if you want it." "I do," Cora said. And with that, she hung up the phone, picked up her notebook, and walked out to the back fence. The chain link shimmered in the sun. Beyond it, the squash leaves had begun curling at the tips, thirsty for tending. The tomatoes drooped, fat with the weight of being ignored. She rested her hand on the cool steel mesh. Soon, she thought, not for revenge, but for restoration. At the next HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse, with fruit platters and clipboards and the usual war of passive-aggressive smiles, Cora showed up quietly and sat near the back. She didn't speak, didn't wave. Most of them didn't even acknowledge her. She was still, in their minds, the fringe case, the holdout landowner from before the subdivision existed. The board president, a man named Douglas who favored pressed polo shirts and sentences that began with "as per policy," opened the floor with a smug summary of the recent security enhancements. "We've successfully enclosed all perimeter vulnerabilities," he said, nodding to the room like a general recounting a battle won. "Access is now limited to HOA members and authorized guests. Unauthorized farming incursions have been resolved." Cora raised an eyebrow at that. Farming incursions? As if her squash rows were military-grade threats. She jotted the phrase in her notebook, underlined it, and said nothing. Another board member, a thin woman named Carly who took HOA enforcement far more seriously than her actual job at the nail salon, chimed in with a note about how external noncompliance had finally been neutralized. Cora almost laughed. She'd spent her life cultivating those fields. Now they talked about them like she'd been running a rogue operation from behind the azaleas. After the meeting, Carly passed by her without a glance. Douglas gave her a curt nod, then whispered to another member, "She'll adapt. Or move." Cora smiled to herself. Not likely. That weekend, she drove to the county clerk's office and filed the formal petition to take legal title to Lot 38B. She paid the fee in cash. No lawyers. No press. She didn't want fanfare. She wanted facts. Over the next 4 weeks, the filing went uncontested. The parcel was officially updated in the land registry database under her name. A 2-sentence update. Owner, Talbot, Cora M. Title, private. No encumbrance. No one noticed. Not the board. Not the clerk at the HOA office who filed complaints about unsanctioned compost bins. Not even the security company hired to monitor easement movement through a poorly positioned camera that hadn't worked properly since the first rainstorm. They weren't looking. They were too busy congratulating themselves for their tidy little gate, too distracted by how neatly the fence framed their walking trails. What they didn't realize, not yet, was that the gate's key, the literal hinge upon which their enclosure depended, now sat inside Cora's desk drawer, placed there by the title transfer paperwork she'd received 2 days earlier. Along with the deed came the legal right to control access through the gate. She hadn't even needed to change the lock. She just changed the law. By October, harvest season had begun without her in the fields. Crops had rotted. Volunteers from the community garden tried to organize a food drive, but failed when the crops were deemed inaccessible. No one connected the dots. No one looked past the metal fence and wondered what it really represented. Until Carly showed up at her front door. It was late afternoon. Cora was shelling beans on the porch. Carly's hair was pulled tight, her shoes too clean for gravel. "We need to talk," she said. Cora nodded toward the other chair. "Have a seat." Carly hesitated, then lowered herself stiffly, as if the act itself cost her pride. "We've had issues," she began. "With access. Apparently, the parcel that houses the main gate isn't under HOA jurisdiction anymore." "It isn't," Cora said, still shelling. "It's mine." Carly blinked. "Excuse me. I purchased it last month. Through quiet title. It was unclaimed. Legally, I now own it." There was a long silence. "You bought the lot that controls the gate?" "I did." "You," Carly sputtered. "You can't, that's legal," Cora finished for her. "And filed. And binding." Carly stood abruptly, flustered. "Well, the board will need to reconsider their definition of access," Cora offered. Carly opened her mouth, closed it again, then turned on her heel and left without another word. That night, Cora walked out to the gate. It gleamed in the moonlight, untouched, undisturbed. She ran her fingers over the keyhole and thought about how many doors had been closed to people like her, quiet women in worn boots, underestimated because they didn't speak in boardroom cadence. Now she held the only key, and not just to a gate, but to a truth that was about to make itself heard. Not through shouting, but through structure. Through one, small, overlooked lot. The kind of victory that doesn't need a banner. Just a boundary. Reclaimed. It started with an email. Polite. Measured. Almost apologetic. Sent from the HOA board's secretary's address, but clearly written by someone else, likely Douglas, whose favorite tone was the kind that smiled while it corrected you. "Dear Ms. Talbot, it has come to our attention that recent administrative shifts regarding Parcel 38B have led to unexpected limitations in member access to the East Community Gate. We kindly request a discussion regarding shared usage rights, maintenance coordination, and possible easement reinstatement. Sincerely, Penridge Meadows HOA." Cora read it once, twice. Then, slowly, she closed her laptop. She didn't respond. Not yet. Because she knew something now, something they were just beginning to understand. This wasn't about a fence anymore. It was about visibility. For years, the board had acted as if their documents and designations were the only language that mattered. They held meetings, printed rules, updated landscaping codes with a sense of infallible authority. But their entire framework had a hinge, and that hinge sat on a square of dirt barely big enough for a garden shed. A forgotten 0.04-acre parcel with a gate and a key. Her key. And suddenly, the woman they never bothered to see was the one person everyone needed to talk to. It didn't take long for the request to escalate. A week after the email came a certified letter. Then a voicemail from a city zoning officer, one who sounded reluctant, like he'd been nudged into the call. "I'm just following up, ma'am. It seems there's some confusion about private right-of-way versus neighborhood easement. We were hoping you might be willing to clarify your intentions regarding access." "My intentions," Cora replied, "are to maintain my property as law allows." He cleared his throat. "Of course. It's just, well, technically, this has impacted community flow. There's some tension. There's been tension since they sealed my crops behind a gate." A pause. Then he quietly said, "You're within your rights." "I know." And that was the end of it. But the board wasn't done. They called an emergency meeting open to residents only, though Cora received 5 separate texts from people she hadn't heard from in years. Neighbors who once waved from their porches but never stopped to talk. Now they were sending screenshots of the agenda. Item 3. Gate access crisis. Parcel ownership conflict. Crisis. That was the word they used now. Not resolution. Not correction. Cora didn't attend the meeting. She stayed home that evening, planting wintergreens in the last of the open soil behind her barn. The sun dipped below the line of trees, casting long shadows that stretched like time. The minutes from the HOA meeting were posted online the next day. She read them while sipping coffee. They were filled with the usual legal padding, concerns about safety, continuity, and the need to avoid disruptions to communal logistics. But one thing stood out. The HOA had formally proposed a buyout of Parcel 38B. The offer? $500. Cora laughed out loud for the first time in days. Not because she needed more. Because they still didn't get it. They thought this was about land. But it had never been just about the land. It was about how they assumed she wouldn't understand her rights. That she wouldn't notice a sliver of jurisdiction tucked beneath decades of development paperwork. That she wouldn't recognize a loophole wide enough to plant a flag in or a field. She drafted a letter, printed it, folded it neatly, walked it down to the HOA office herself. It read, "To whom it may concern. Parcel 38B is under private ownership and is not for sale. As the sole owner of the parcel containing the Eastern Community Gate, I retain full rights of access, maintenance, and entry. Any request for cooperative access may be directed to my office in writing. Note that all such requests will be reviewed individually and subject to property usage terms that prioritize equitable treatment and community accountability. Sincerely, Cora May Talbot, owner, Parcel 38B." She placed it on the front desk and walked out. By that afternoon, everything changed. The board called an emergency assembly. They'd never had to negotiate before. Not with someone they couldn't push. Not with someone they'd spent years overlooking. Suddenly, a woman who wore rubber boots and tied her hair with twine was dictating access to their most expensive amenity, a shortcut through her history they'd paved over without asking. Residents began to notice. Not just the board members. The neighbors. They started to whisper. "Did you hear she owns the gate now? Wasn't she the one they fenced out? I thought she was just the lady with the chickens." Cora didn't mind the whispers. Whispers were better than silence. Better than being treated like a landscape feature in someone else's neighborhood. One evening, a family with 2 small children came to her door. The mother looked sheepish. "We used to walk through the trail behind your field to get to the school bus stop. It cut 10 minutes off our mornings." Cora nodded. "I remember seeing you. The woman hesitated. "I didn't know what they'd done until it was already up. I'm sorry. It wasn't right." Cora looked at the children. "You're not locked out because of me. You're locked out because they forgot who lived here before they arrived." The mother didn't reply, just looked down. "But you're welcome to walk through," Cora added. "Just close the gate behind you." The woman's face lit up. "Really? It's my field, not a fortress." That was how it started. Informal at first. A neighbor here. A jogger there. Cora kept a logbook, took down names, issued simple rules. Respect the rows. No vehicles. No litter. No noise. Within 2 weeks, more than 24 residents had signed involuntarily. The gate, once a symbol of exclusion, became a lesson in humility. People who never learned her name now brought baskets of fresh bread, offers to help weed the edges, or just sat and listened as she spoke about seed rotation and soil health. And one day, Douglas came. Stiff posture. Dress shoes on gravel. He stood at the edge of her driveway with a clipboard and a forced smile. "I was hoping we could come to a more formal agreement," he said. "Something official. Something we can file." Cora wiped her hands on her jeans. "An agreement would require you to admit what happened." His jaw tightened. "Look, the board." "I don't care about the board," she said. "I care about access. I care about fairness. You tried to take both from me. Now you want courtesy without accountability. I'm just trying to make this manageable." "So am I," she replied. "That's why the key stays in my drawer. Not to lock you out, but to make sure you don't lock anyone else in." He didn't reply. Didn't need to. She turned and walked back to her field. The gate stood silent behind her. Unchanged. But everything else had begun to move. Not because she forced it, but because she waited until they saw her. And when they finally did, they realized. She had been holding the gate all along. The key wasn't fancy. It didn't gleam under the light or click with ceremony. It was old, forged in a small-town locksmith shop decades ago when the gate had been little more than a cattle crossing. The ridges were worn smooth from time and weather, and the tiny brass tag that once read East Access was tarnished and bent. But in Cora May Talbot's hands, it might as well have been the crown jewel of Penridge Meadows. She kept it in a drawer lined with felt, right beneath her checkbook and garden shears. Not because she was sentimental, but because she understood what it now represented. This key was no longer about access. It was about memory, about dignity, about every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong in a place she helped build. By November, the field had changed. So had the neighborhood. The air, once filled with the clatter of suspicion, had quieted into something else, attentiveness. People began asking questions, not out of politeness, but out of curiosity born from late realization. They wanted to understand who she really was. Some approached with cautious guilt, others with unexpected admiration. "I had no idea you owned so much land," one woman said while carrying a tray of muffins to Cora's porch. "I thought it was just you and the chickens." Cora smiled faintly. "It's always more than what you think it is." And it was. The parcel she'd acquired, the forgotten lot that held the gate, had become a pivot point in community conversation. Not because she had made noise about it, but because she hadn't. Her restraint was its own revelation. People were used to confrontation, to power being loud. But she had done something more profound. She controlled everything without raising her voice once. That scared some of them. It inspired others. One evening, as dusk fell purple over the horizon, the local high school civics teacher, Mr. Rowland, asked if she'd speak to the students about property rights and land use. "I think they could learn from what you did here," he said. "Most of them don't even know how zoning laws work, let alone how to read a title deed." Cora chuckled softly. "You want me to talk to teenagers about real estate?" "No," he said. "I want you to talk to them about being underestimated, and how you didn't let that become your story." She agreed. The following week, she stood in a classroom full of half-interested eyes and digital distractions. She brought nothing with her but a copy of the original map, the deed to Lot 38B, and the key, the same one that had sparked it all. She didn't speak like a teacher. She spoke like someone telling the truth. She showed them the survey lines, explained how corporations often bought up parcels and forgot about them, how people assumed ownership until the ink proved otherwise. "But what's more important than owning land," she said, "is understanding how people treat you when they think you don't." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Why didn't you fight louder when they fenced you out?" Cora paused. "Because I don't owe anyone noise to prove I was wronged. I owe myself clarity." And I had it. The class was quiet. No one checked their phone. Afterward, a boy with a hoodie that swallowed his frame came up to her privately. "My grandma owns some land out near Dry Creek. Nobody really pays attention to it, but she says it's been in the family forever. Should we look at the deed?" "You absolutely should," Cora said. By Thanksgiving, word had spread beyond the subdivision. An article appeared in the county bulletin, "The Woman Who Bought the Key." The writer had been tactful, weaving in legal terminology with human weight. They called her a local steward of legacy, a phrase Cora didn't recognize but appreciated for its attempt at sincerity. The article ended with a quote. "I didn't buy the lot to block anyone out. I bought it to remind them how easily they erased me." The HOA, meanwhile, was scrambling. Their plan to quietly absorb the field into long-term development strategy had unraveled the moment Cora's deed became public. No one had officially approved it, of course, but a few ambitious board members had spoken of reclaiming underused adjacent space in committee notes. Now, those ambitions were dead in the water, and they knew it. So, the board sent a delegation. It arrived one afternoon, 3 members in stiff slacks and neutral tones, their smiles so forced they could have been stitched. Douglas was not among them. Instead, they sent the younger ones, new faces, hoping to start fresh. "Miss Talbot," one began, "we were hoping to discuss a mutual use proposal." Cora invited them to sit on the porch. They laid out a plan, shared access, written acknowledgement of her parcel ownership, joint maintenance of the gate. They spoke of transparency, inclusion, reform. Cora listened. Then she asked one question. "Will you make a public apology?" They shifted in their seats. "An apology," she repeated. "Not just to me. To everyone you've talked over. Everyone you've shamed with notices and fines. Everyone you reduced to rules instead of recognizing them as neighbors." One of them, a young woman with hopeful eyes, said softly, "I will." Cora nodded. "Then we'll talk." And they did. The gate stayed in place. But the policy changed. Access was reinstated to the trail, under Cora's terms. No fencing without individual property owner consultation. No changes to usage rights without landowner review. The HOA was forced to reissue their charter with new language. Respect precedes policy. But the greatest change wasn't in paperwork. It was in posture. Neighbors who once dismissed her began to pause. They brought her baked goods, yes, but also questions. How to grow tomatoes in clay soil. Whether bees helped squash. What book she read in winter. They asked, not out of guilt, but out of genuine interest. Because now they saw her not as the old woman on the edge of town, but as someone who had held the key to something deeper than a gate. One afternoon, Carly knocked on her door. No clipboard. No sunglasses. Just her. I was wrong, she said. I'm not good at saying that. But I was. I made you feel like you didn't matter. Cora didn't offer a lecture. She didn't even say, I forgive you. She simply said, you see me now. And Carly nodded. I do. That night, Cora stood by the gate again. The sun dipped low, staining the sky in copper and rust. She touched the latch, then the post, then the fence. It didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a reminder that sometimes power isn't what you take, it's what you guard. And sometimes the strongest gatekeeper is the one who doesn't need to lock the door. By the time spring softened the edges of Penridge Meadows again, the fields behind the fence were no longer merely fields. They were reminders. Every blossom, every row of green, every bee hovering over a bloom whispered something the HOA had once refused to hear. You do not get to define someone just because you control the sidewalk. The gate still stood where it always had, tall, silver, practical. But now it bore a small wooden sign Cora had carved herself and hung with twine. It read, simply, Respect lives here. And it wasn't just a sentiment. It had become a fact. Cora hadn't just changed policy. She'd changed culture. It began with the neighbors. Not all at once, but in gentle waves. The ones who had once judged her from a distance now lingered near the edge of her land, asking how her tomatoes survived the frost or what kind of mulch she used around the pole beans. Teenagers from the school volunteered to help prep her beds for the summer harvest, some because their civics teacher had made her story required reading, others because their parents had whispered about her in the kitchen with a new kind of reverence. One Saturday morning, a young man named Malik stood at her fence and asked if he could borrow a few hours of her time. My mom said you knew what to do when people stopped listening, he said. I need help writing something for my scholarship essay. I want to talk about land, about belonging. Cora invited him in. He left with more than an outline. He left with a lesson. By midsummer, the path that ran behind her field had unofficially become known as Cora's Way. It wasn't on any map, but everyone used the name: joggers, cyclists, children walking to school. There were no rules posted, no cameras, no printed permits. And yet, not one wrapper littered the grass. Not one shoe scuffed the beds. Because people protect what they've been invited to, not what they're ordered to obey. Even the HOA changed. Douglas quietly stepped down from the board. No scandal, no announcement. Just an email thanking members for the opportunity to serve, and a note that he'd be spending more time with family. But everyone knew the real reason. He had become irrelevant, not because Cora ousted him, but because her presence had made his posturing obsolete. Carly remained, but changed. She took over community outreach, something she once approached with laminated flyers and warnings. Now, she walked the neighborhood in sneakers and a ball cap, asking questions instead of issuing citations. One afternoon, she knocked on Cora's door with a new proposal in hand. We're planning a community day, she said, and we'd like to use your field. Cora raised an eyebrow. For what? Workshops. Local vendors. Gardening demos. I thought maybe you'd lead one. Teach people how to start tomatoes from seed. Cora smiled softly. You want me to teach the neighborhood how to plant? I want them to learn how to listen, Carly said. You taught me that starts with roots. Cora agreed, on one condition. Every station, every table, every activity had to be led by someone who'd once been told they weren't qualified enough to speak. Retired janitors. Disabled veterans. Stay-at-home mothers. People who had never been invited to run the mic, but who had entire libraries inside them. It was the most attended event in Penridge Meadows history. Kids potted seedlings beside elders who remembered farming without machines. One man gave a talk on rainwater collection using nothing but a whiteboard in his hands. A woman who had once been fined for planting wildflowers in her front yard ran a workshop on native pollinators. At the center of it all stood Cora's table, where she quietly showed people how to press their thumb into damp soil and feel what kind of season they were in. She didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. People came to her not for advice, but for truth. And they listened. When the day ended, Carly stood before the remaining crowd and made an announcement. We'd like to name this community event in honor of the woman who reminded us that land remembers its stewards, even when people forget them. She turned to Cora. And we'd like to formally rename the East Gate access as Talbot Crossing. There were cheers. Not the forced kind. The real kind. Cora stood slowly and took the mic, her hands resting lightly on the wood podium. I didn't do any of this for a name on a gate, she said. I did it because fences don't just divide land. They divide people. And someone has to remember how to open them again. She paused. And when you do, you don't just let others in. You let yourself be seen. She handed the mic back and walked to the edge of her field. That evening, as the sun spilled its last gold onto the soil, she unlocked the gate for the 100th time. But it felt like the first. Because this time, no one had to ask. They already knew. And she knew, too, that what she had built was more than crops, more than quiet revenge, more than a twist in a town that loved gossip. She had built a legacy not with lawsuits or loudspeakers, but with rows of truth and the patience to let people grow into the realization of their own smallness. The key still lived in her drawer. Not because she needed it, but because symbols matter. Sometimes it's not the gate you open. It's what it opens in others. Weeks later, someone left a small envelope on her porch. No return address. Just a folded note and a gift card to the local hardware store. The note read, "You never slammed the door. You just waited on the other side. Thank you for holding it open, even when we didn't deserve it." Cora tucked it inside the same folder as the deed, the map, and her father's handwritten notes from a lifetime ago. And then she went outside and planted something new.